that's me when I was 5 years old. And if you were to ask my kindergarten teacher what I was like when I was a kid, she had said, Esra will never have trouble making friends. If you asked my mom, she would have said, Esra's fearless. She's not afraid of jumping off stuff, which hasn't really changed. And just also, my mom always says, like, I always knew what I wanted, and I'd always run after it and do it. And then, of course, you grow up and you mature, and you find a way of enunciating these things a little bit more elegantly. And so this is something that I think has always kind of defined me and my outlook, which is ask yourself what you want and do what you have to do. And I think it's this thinking that kind of underpins every type of coaching or mentoring or goal setting or anything like that. It's very simple. Just ask yourself what you want and do what you have to do. And so when I was 16 years old, the thing that I wanted to do most was to play ice hockey. Now, I was born and raised in Sydney, Australia, and so you might be thinking, well, there's not a whole lot of ice in Australia, Esra. And yes, not a whole lot of winter, not a whole lot of winter sports. But what we did have, unfortunately, was a little bit of prejudice. Because at 16, I was quite good, and so I started training with the boys. Now, women weren't allowed to play with men because men play contact, they hit each other, so we weren't allowed to do that, but you were allowed to train with the boys. And then one day, all of a sudden, this new rule comes up. As a girl, you're not allowed to even train with the boys. And I remember the coach telling me this. He was very sympathetic. It wasn't his decision. But then that night I thought, I'm going to be upset for this for one day, and then the next day I have to pull myself together and decide what to do. So I was 16 years old at the time, thinking this way. And I thought, okay, and it was kind of in a revenge way too. The best thing that I can do is go to the best place to play ice hockey. So I decided I wanted to go to Canada. And I didn't have financial independence when I was 16, so I basically lobbied my parents every night until they said yes to send me. And the reason I was so confident in this is because I knew once I had got to Canada, I could make this work. So off I went at 16, and my mum came with me for the first month to Vancouver, where she happened to meet somebody on the Canadian national team who said, no, you're wasting your time, you need to go to Calgary. Now, if you've seen Cool Runnings when they come out of the airport, it's exactly like that. The first year that I lived in Calgary, it was minus 54 degrees with wind chill. It was so cold that your eyelashes would freeze shut, the hairs in your nose would freeze, and the snow was so cold that once you start walking, it starts squeaking on the ice. So anyway, off I went to Calgary. And the place that I went to turned out to be an Olympic training facility that was left over from the 1988 Winter Olympics. And they had decided that one year that they were going to start this high-performance women's hockey program and invite women from all over the world to go and train there. So I was the first international person and the first Australian to go and play hockey there. And this is what I call my field of dreams. It's basically 2 full-size ice hockey rinks and an ice track all the way around it with a 450-meter running track around that. And there were 6 sprinting lanes over here. And the real Jamaican bobsled team did train in this facility as well, which was quite entertaining. Now, we used to train 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, 11 months of the year. And I did this knowing that in my lifetime, that as an Australian, Turkish woman, that Australia would never make the Olympics in women's hockey. There's just too many teams and you need to qualify. And also that there was no professional women's hockey at the time. Okay, well, so why did I do this? Well, I did it because it was the thing I loved most, and I didn't want to spend my time doing anything else. And I also think that life is very short, so you really have to go after the things that you are passionate about. Now, while I was there, most of the girls that I played with were either national team or became national team athletes, and even my old roommate actually was a gold medalist and appeared on the Wheaties box in the US. And I still know quite a lot of people who are like that. Now, when you're surrounded by crazy people like that and all you want to do is sports, you learn to excel. Because you've basically given up your social life, your personal life, your everything life, and you're just pursuing a goal, you're just pursuing a dream. So the lesson that I learned from that is to keep company with those who make you better. Another way of saying it would be, there's this quote of, you are the 5 people, you are the average of the 5 people that you associate with most, so choose wisely. So that was the first sliding doors moment in my life. The second sliding doors moment of my life was actually moving to Turkey. So I mentioned that I was born and raised in Australia, but all I knew about Turkey as a little kid was that you'd go to your grandparents' house every few years, you'd eat lots of food, you'd play on the streets, you'd get away with all of the stuff that you'd never get away with in Sydney, and then you'd go back home. But I was working at the UN at the time, and people found out I was Turkish, like, oh, Turkey's this amazing country, and I didn't know about this amazing country. So in 2004, I did a tour of Turkey, and on the way out of Turkey, the bus was stopping, drove past Ankara on the way to Istanbul. My family lives in Ankara, so I got off and I went to go meet my great uncle. Now, my great uncle was actually a big deal in Turkey, Dr. Esra Doğramacı. And of course, I didn't know this because for me, the West was the best. I didn't know any of this. So I went to go meet him, and he was the first person who sat me down and actually said, what is it that you want to do in your life after all of this hockey stuff? Now, at the time, I had been accepted into NYU, and I was waitlisted for Columbia. And he said, well, why don't you just come here and study? So I ended up actually taking a leave of absence from the UN, and I thought, okay, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? If I don't like it, I can go back. But moving to Turkey changed my life. It changed my life because it opened up all of these other doors. It opened up a different world. I'd always lived kind of in this Western perspective, and I was seeing something completely different. And on the ice hockey front, there were only a few girls playing ice hockey when I went to Turkey, and by the time I left 6 years later, there were 5 women's teams and a national team, and I'd like to think I had something to do with that. Another thing that happened because of moving to Turkey that would have never happened if I stayed in Australia or in Canada was I went to Iraq as an election observer in the 2009 parliamentary elections. And on behalf of the Turkish Foreign Ministry. And so I remember when this email went around saying, does anybody want to go? I was so nervous that they would be overwhelmed with applications and I wouldn't get selected. But actually hardly anyone applied. And I applied. And I think I did it just because I was fearless. And I had kind of made peace with myself and spoken to everybody. And I thought, okay, you know the risks, but you can go there. I put 2.5 inflection points. And the reason that I put half in is that those 2 that I previously talked about are about things that I was in control of. But there's also things that we aren't in control of either, but they can also change your life. So when I was a student in the US, I had an opportunity to go do an internship in New York City, my one and only internship. And the day before I was due to fly back to Wisconsin, I wanted to go and take some black and white pictures. I used to go shoot black and white. And a friend of mine had told me, oh, why don't you go to this building downtown? There's a series of 6 escalators, and why don't you catch the morning rush hour traffic? So those escalators would be full of people coming upstairs, and she thought it would make an interesting shot. So I thought, oh yeah, that's a good idea. So the day I was supposed to get up and go, I had overslept my alarm by about half an hour, so I was late. When I finally got myself together to head out, the phone rang. So this is before mobile phone time, or kind of before mobile phone time. And I answered the phone, so that delayed me about 5 minutes as well. When I was finally on my way, I realized that I had forgotten a check at home that I needed to cash that day. But what I didn't know is it was actually in my bag. But when I turned back to go and get the check was when the first plane flew into the World Trade Center. And the World Trade Center is where I was headed that morning. So I don't want to talk about this made me realize how precious life is or not to take things for granted, because I think I'd already had lessons in my life that had taught me those. But I think if we're talking about sliding doors, you do have to think about sometimes maybe the universe is sending you messages, or you do have to pay attention and listen to your intuition. This is a result, by the way, of not listening to my intuition. So, okay, so well, what does this all mean? So I heard recently that the Earth geologically is 4.5 billion years old. 4.5 billion years old. So on average, you and I will have about 70 to 80 years on this planet, as will our parents, 70 to 80 years, and our offspring. So in the grand scheme of things, that's not a whole lot of time, and so we don't even really matter, really, in that 4.5 billion years. But the thing that does matter is doing what makes you happy. And then if you're somebody like my great uncle who's able to build a hospital and build the first private university in Turkey and do service to people around you and to be something bigger than what you are yourself, then great. But I think we have to pursue the things that catch our heart and not just run after the things that catch our eye. All along the way, you are going to have people who tell you no. When I told people that I was going to go to Canada and play ice hockey, there was no shortage of people who thought that it was the dumbest idea to do. I mean, even now in your professional lives, you'll have an idea and people are ready to bring you down. Sometimes it's jealousy and sometimes it's fear, but you really have to listen. You really have to not listen to the naysayers. And I suppose, just to finish everything, this has been another one of the guiding quotes that I've had for my life. This is from actually No Fear, which is a sporting company. But this is what I always used to think about in Calgary. Because I was scared. I was the Australian, I was the newcomer, and all these other girls had so much more experience than me. But you always have a decision. You can either hesitate, or you can face your fears and live your dreams. Because I think, in the shortness of life that we have, you have to be brave in life. I'm Esra Dogramaci. Thank you very much.